I will personally meet between 400 and 500 companies a year. There's a term I stole from the nonprofit world called resource magnetism, which means like you're just the type of person that brings things towards you. So you don't have to like show up in a certain way, but like people want to take a risk on you. People want to work with you. Enterprise clients want to say yes. Like, is there a really deep motivation as the journey gets really tough? Because being a founder is incredibly tough.
Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook Podcast, where we share inspiring startup stories with practical takeaways for you, the listener. Today's guest is Maria Palma, who's a general partner at Kindred Capital. They're a venture capital firm that focuses on seed and pre-seed investments, especially in European tech. Many of you listening today might be exactly the type of person they're looking for, so I encourage you to check them out and see whether or not you might be able to get funding from them. Maria has a really varied history before joining Kindred and has worked across the world in New York, Brazil, India, and now in the UK. She's worked at both small startups and large enterprises, which gives her a really nuanced view on how to make a company successful, and she brings this to her investments. She's also the host of Kindred's podcast, Founders Uncut, where, much like we do here, she talks to different founders about the reality behind building their businesses. This is a great conversation. Let's get onto the show. Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook, Maria. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So you've got a really interesting story and you've invested in so many great companies. But can you tell the audience, why did you start in the entrepreneurship world in the first place? What got you excited about it?
I mean, to be honest, I didn't really know what it looked like before I got in. I was working at GE Healthcare at the time, doing various jobs in supply chain operations, which I really enjoyed because I learned a lot about teams and culture and people. Lots of good failures I learned from as well. But I noticed that all the jobs I liked were ambiguous. And I thought that maybe that would mean that I would like startups, which were pretty full of ambiguity. All the jobs I liked were kind of, you have to go from point A to point B and it's not clear how to get there at all. And a lot of supply chain in a huge company is much more structured. But I had, quite frankly, no idea what startups look like. I was not in the know. I grew up in Wisconsin. I had worked in one industry. Like I just wasn't around a lot of it. And so I found this woman who had done a startup in India and she had a distribution deal with GE, and I actually just cold emailed her. I went back to do my MBA for a few years, and that's when I really dug into startups more deeply. But I just cold emailed her and said, can I come work for you for the summer? And then I loved it. And from there, I just kept working with earlier stage startups in different environments and caught the bug and just felt like I'm never going to do anything else because it was really exciting and fun and really fit my personality.
So that's interesting because I know like with the different entrepreneurs that have come on in the past, some of them are very pro MBA and some of them are very like, you don't need it, you could just go straight into it. But you found that doing your MBA gave you that inflection point and made you kind of see like, oh, this is another area which could be really interesting.
So I think you definitely don't need it, right? I think you absolutely don't need an MBA today. And I think especially if you actually know what you want to do, then, and you're already on that path, it's quite expensive. I think the thing that people undersell though is the life experience of the MBA. It's not so much like, do you need it as a check the box? And I'm not going to lie. There was a little part of me that also like as a woman in the workforce felt like having an extra stamp maybe helped, which may or may not be true. But as I'm about due with my second child, I felt like people would be more willing to take a risk on you with certain credentials potentially, which I feel like is less true now, but maybe was more true then, or maybe unfortunately is still true. But I feel like for me, the life experience of the MBA was incredible. And to me, it afforded me the opportunity to try different things, right? And even I worked for a startup in India. I worked for a tech accelerator in Brazil. I would have been hard pressed to just land in Brazil and get a really good job opportunity without a big network helping me. So I think for me, it was a good time to experiment. But in my case, it definitely allowed me some time to explore what I wanted to do.
Yeah, I think this is also the case when some entrepreneurs, for example, say like, oh, you don't need to go to university. But I said that you don't need to go to university if you know what you want to do. But when you don't, it's a good way to gain skills and learn. And then like same with the MBA. And then from there, sometimes you meet people. And like I said, it's the networking effect.
Yeah, but even university, I think the thing that people forget a lot, it's definitely people are going less and less these days, but it's just the social component, right? I think it's like especially everywhere in the world, but I went to university in the US and there's such a huge social component of the friends that you build and how you think about things. And I think it teaches you more to think holistically as opposed to it's, you have to do this degree to get this job per se.
Yeah. And like you said, you started with the startup in India. Where did the journey go from there?
So I worked for a startup in India and I absolutely loved it. And I got quite excited about entrepreneurship in emerging markets, which I still am, but do more on the side now. And I just think the energy is incredible and the pace of change was incredible. And so you don't get that many times in your life to just move other countries. And I had lived abroad actually a few times briefly in India and in Brazil and Australia. And it had just challenged me personally to see a different lens on the world and look at myself in different ways. And it just kind of, I feel like I grew the most in those moments. And so I wanted to do more of that. And if I had had money, I probably would have gap yeared and traveled, but I didn't. So I just worked for other people in different places. So then I moved to Brazil between B-school years, and I worked for a tech accelerator, which was really early stage startups, which I loved. And I tried to co-found something with one of those teams for the next year while I was still in business school. It didn't work, but I learned a lot. And then I moved to the New York ecosystem, largely for personal reasons at the moment. Joined an early stage ad tech startup there and was with them for a number of years, from about 0 to 40 million in revenue, before I went over to the venture side. And so I was always on the operating side. And actually a friend of mine, I worked with some nonprofits on the side and was involved for many years with an incredible organization called African Entrepreneur Collective that works with both founders in cities, but also founders in refugee camps in Africa. And a friend of mine noticed that like I was just spending all my free time helping founders, and they're like, you should go into venture where you can do this at scale. But to me as an operator, venture always seemed like this thing for smart people who didn't really hustle and not as people oriented, which I've found is not the case, but it did seem like that to me at the time from the interactions I had.
You said there about like you've been into India, Brazil, and you also worked a lot with African founders as well. At the moment, like what's one of the emerging markets that you find really interesting about the things that the startup ecosystem is doing?
So at the moment I focus a lot on Europe because that's where we do at Kindred. But I think Africa is an incredible opportunity right now. I've done like a few, I joke that I don't have money to angel invest. So I micro angel sometimes, which is like literally I put like $1,000 into something. But I think there's some really cool stuff going on the continent of Africa, both from a crypto lens, which I do a lot of crypto Web3 stuff as well, and from a traditional fintech, traditional startup lens. I think there's some really incredible energy and great teams being built there right now.
Let's say like there's a African entrepreneur listening right now. What kind of things do you think they could potentially be doing to access the venture capital world? Because I guess traditionally it's not always been open to them.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more funds now. So I feel like I know a number of funds that have focused just on the continent. And there's also specialist funds, right? So I think we tend to have a geography focus at Kindred. So, we're Europe, and that includes some Israel as well. But there are a lot of funds that are like fintech funds that are completely global. And I think that post-pandemic, now that you can meet everyone on Zoom, it's actually much easier to access capital from wherever you are than it was before.
So tell me more about what you've done at Kindred so far. So what are the companies you're invested in, and why did you pick those ones?
Yeah, so it is I feel very fortunate to be in this job. You get to meet a lot of incredible people. I've done 6 deals so far at Kindred. So there's a few. So I've invested in a life insurance company out of Spain called Vitance, and I actually invested in a life insurance company in the US before called Ladder. So I had a lot of views on the space. So I did have to educate myself on what was different in the ecosystem in Europe. I've invested in a company called Mojo Men, which is a sexual well-being platform for men in Europe and the US, and starts with erectile dysfunction, but can go into other areas. And I'm in a care home marketplace called Lottie. And the common theme across every company I've invested in is just founders. For me, it's absolutely the best founders that I meet, and then markets that I believe in, right? And the last few deals I've done, 2 have been in Web3, and 1 has actually been in chemistry, which I knew very little about, quite frankly. But it's really the founders that you believe are the best people in Europe to back, and that for some have the right reason to be building that company specifically as well.
Yeah, what do you look for in those founders? You said like how do you know that they're the best people to build that company?
So, there's a lot of judgment in this job. That doesn't mean it's the right judgment and the right decision, but I think I will personally meet between 400 and 500 companies a year, and there's no recipe. So I don't think I've thought a lot about founder traits, and I can tell you some that I like to think through, but the truth is you can't really put a recipe on it, especially we're at pre-seed and seed at the early days. It doesn't work, right? And I think from a diversity and inclusion perspective, you have to be careful not to expect people to show up in this certain ways, right? Like just because someone doesn't come in and own a room doesn't mean that they can't build an incredible startup and an incredible team. So there are some things that I like to think about, like obviously like resilience and self-awareness and some obvious ones. There's a term I stole from the nonprofit world that I spent some time in called resource magnetism, which means like you're just the type of person that brings things towards you. So you don't have to like show up in a certain way, but like people want to take a risk on you. People want to work with you. Enterprise clients want to say yes. And I think that some people do have that quality, but I think about it more as like, why is this person founding this company? And is there a really deep motivation that as the journey gets really tough, because being a founder is incredibly tough, how are they going to stick with it and what's really motivating them? And then I do a bit of a unique thing where I do, if I'm far down a process and about to invest in a company, I'll do a much deeper dive on the personal side. So I'll let them get to know me more personally, things that I have done well, things I've done horribly, how I think about culture and teams. And then I get to know them more personally. And I go into how I think they're going to build the team, which is really important to me. Because at the end of the day, I don't care if you're building a crypto payments rail startup or a consumer startup, you have to attract the best talent and retain them, which is the key to anything. But I think one thing I've noticed across everyone I invest in is there's always something in that session that I'm like, yep, this is the person. It's never the same thing. And it's never like a specific common thread I can give you, but there's something in their story that just for me is like, this is the type of person that's going to go do something incredible.
Yeah, and you mentioned there about like you want to be on the same page about how to build the team out and how to grow the company. What kind of way do you like to like build teams? What's the philosophy you have there?
So we don't have to be on the same page at all. I just want to understand what theirs is, right? And I think it's more important that you have your own authentic way to do it and you are being thoughtful about it. Because I think at the end of the day, it's not a founder alone who builds a company, it's a team of people. And one of the things that I've learned also the hard way is that people talk a lot about like firing quickly and firing right and all that. And I think that's an important conversation, but people don't talk enough, in my view, about retaining talent and developing talent. And one of the most painful things that I've experienced and seen is people losing their best talent just because they didn't have good managers, right? So a lot of smart young people join startups and then they get promoted because they were good at getting towards a goal. And you know what they're pretty good at when you promote them to run a team? Getting towards a goal. That's how they got there, right? So they usually deliver on that piece well, but they often don't know how to manage a team, don't know how to develop people, don't know how to set the right expectations. And so you lose your best talent sometimes. You think they were great and they think they were great, but they think that means they were getting promoted in 6 months. And you think that means they're getting promoted in a year and a half. And no one had that conversation. And I think just better management practices and thoughtfulness around culture and the people that you hire and keeping the bar really high is something that's really important to me in any company that I back.
Yeah, and I guess what you're saying there as well, sometimes it's not necessarily what their plan is, just that they have a plan and they have thought through these kind of problems that could come up. And in like the companies you've had, they've lost people because of bad management. What kind of things do you advise to the startups you work with to try to avoid those problems? How do you advise them to retain the talent?
Yeah, so I mean, pretty much any company I work with, we talk about defining the values really early on in the company journey and not just defining them in terms of what they are, but how to then go the next level deeper and operationalize them and figure out how do you know if you're actually living those values? How do you hire against those values? And how do you also allow for room for those values to change? Because every person is going to be a culture ad and they're going to change something and you want that. I think it looks a little bit different in every culture, but I'm very encouraging of my companies to spend the time on that. And it's stuff that I look for in board meetings, right? The same way I look for how their commercial KPIs are doing and what their financials look like. I also, if you have a large number of turnover, you probably want to be double clicking on that. And if anyone leaves from the senior executive team, I usually personally interview them or someone from the board interviews them just to understand, is there other stuff going on in the culture we should be aware of? In my time at startups, at least like when I was on the operating side, most of the moments that actually mattered for the company, when they lost the best talent, when it was the toughest to be in the company, the board actually had no clue that they were going on.
So you've got 6 different companies you're looking at the moment, and you've been helping like Kindred raise funds. And what's the kind of ambitions you have like as you go further with Kindred? Like what are the areas you're now looking at that you think are potentially really exciting for the future?
Yeah, so we back anything, but I do a lot of fintech and crypto as well. So on the crypto Web3 side, this year I've done a crypto fiat payments company. I've done a community tooling company that allows you to kind of spin up a Discord channel, NFTs, like anything you need to run a community at the drop of a hat. It's really hard to hire developers to do that. And so I think for me on the crypto side specifically, there's really a lot around infrastructure layer. You'll probably also see me spending more time in the Bitcoin Lightning ecosystem than some investors do. I do spend time in Ethereum and Solana as well, but I think a lot of VCs ignore that space, quite frankly. I have looked a lot at some specific payments rail stuff in the Europe right now, some B2B infrastructure and B2B payment plays. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about right now, but it kind of changes based on the moment in time and what you're seeing in market.
So like there's been a lot of like things in the news recently and like lots of chatter on Twitter about the crypto winter and funds starting to dry up. And like, what's your view on that in terms of, especially in the crypto space, where some companies got quite significant investment in the last year or so, and then now because the price of the different currencies have dropped, where do you think the future's heading with this? Like, do you think that the companies you're like betting on and the infrastructure layer, when do you expect that to kind of come to fruition? Are you thinking it's going to be a long-term play? Do you think it's going to be in the next year things are going to turn around?
Yeah, so I have a very venture lens on what I do in crypto. So, I mean, if you want to just make money in crypto, there's a lot of quick things you could do. But I have an equity hat on. And so I want things that make monetize well and potentially exit in a 7 to 10 year time horizon. And that's actually hard to get right in crypto because sometimes things go way faster than you expect and sometimes things go way slower than you expect. But I've been in the space since 2015 and have consistently been in the space as a believer. And I think that for me, crypto winters are fine. Actually, crypto winters are probably, I mean, they're better for me as an investor personally, right? Because all the tourist money goes away. It like the crazy overvaluation prices also go away. And you have real teams building real things. And quite frankly, in my view, if I was a founder building the space, I wouldn't want someone coming in who then was going to freak out at the first sign of a crypto winter because that's just the nature of the industry right now. You're going to have ups, you're going to have downs. I try to look at the fundamentals and I try not to get attached to any one run up. Like to me, NFTs felt a lot like ICOs in 2017. I do a crypto costume every year just because the space changes so fast and it just became like a kind of a signature thing. But I was like an NFT back in 2018. And I feel like there's always these moments in time that become bigger than they probably should be and a bit overhyped. And then that's going to come back down somehow, right? But that doesn't mean that there aren't existing use cases for NFTs or tokenization that won't stay and be interesting. And so I think the hard part as an investor is to figure out which trends you think actually play out in the next few years and also just keep some fundamentals on the ground about what types of things you want to back.
So I guess if we rewind a little bit further there, where last year it looked like lots of valuations getting a bit too high and a bit too frothy. And we've seen with places like Netflix and Peloton where people assume that these pandemic era trends were just going to continue indefinitely. And as an investor, obviously, if you're looking at that longer term horizon, how difficult was that for you to try and get through that noise where you potentially thought a company was very good fundamentally, but then the prices they were raising at just felt too high to you?
Yeah, I think you have to maintain discipline. I think it's, as an investor though, it's really important. I mean, don't get me wrong. It was really easy to get caught up in the FOMO last year. And I was tempted many, many times. I think there's some times where you do have to compromise. Like we have a, high conviction model, which means we have a certain ownership threshold. And there was deals that really pressed us on that. And so we had to make a decision every single time on, are we okay waiving this or not? And what does it mean? I think that it's not even just in crypto. Overall last year, I think you're now looking at a lot of companies who are going to have to go to market in the next 24 months saying, oh crap, how am I going to grow into that valuation? And these are things that were talked about last year and we told founders. And I think unless you've lived through a down market before, it was hard to see the writing on the wall. There was I believe it was a Founder Collective article on it was kind of like why you shouldn't raise, if you could raise 3 on 10, why shouldn't you just raise 6 on 20 instead of 3 on 10? And what will be the difference? And it was a really good article. And it was just basically saying unless you believe you can build twice as fast or scale twice as fast, you really want to set yourself up for success at every round. And so I think same for venture capitalists, a lot of people deployed in 18 months. And unless you believe that companies are being built as quickly or there's 2 or 3 times as much good talent in the space, you probably shouldn't be deploying 2 or 3 times as quickly because it's not necessarily going to be a great vintage. And so, there is a whole time and portfolio approach to a venture fund and getting returns. And I think you have to always keep that in mind. So don't get me wrong. It's hard when you love a company, but then the valuations just get bid up significantly, but it also just means I have to do my job better and be there earlier and also sell our product. And if it's the right thing, that'll work. And if it's not, then we're going to lose that one.
Yeah, because obviously, as you said, Kindred looks at pre-seed and seed. So you're getting companies where they don't necessarily have the massive track record yet.
I mean, massive track record. Half the time they don't have a pitch. Half the time they haven't changed their LinkedIn status to I'm a stealth founder. There's nothing sometimes.
So what made you interested in that really early stage as opposed to later stages when people maybe do have a bit more that you can dig into?
Yeah, so in my last fund, it was primarily a Series A fund. And we also did some seed, but it wasn't the core strategy. Core strategy was Series A. And I mean, I went into venture because I wanted to help founders. And so I actually went into venture on the operating side, on the platform side. And then I switched to investing actually to go deeper with fewer teams. I like building pretty deep relationships with people. And at the RRE, that was really on the investor side because you go deeper with fewer teams. And then when I was coming to Europe and I was thinking about what type of fund to join, I was trying to be really honest with myself about what I really enjoyed and where I thought I was actually a better investor. And the reason that I really liked RRE's approach to Series A was that because you really get to be involved with the companies at Series A and you stay on the board and you're on through the life of the company. But because Kindred is also a high conviction model, we're not kind of spraying and praying into hundreds of companies. You really do get to go deep with the teams and build really good relationships. And I think I have better arbitrage personally at the seed and pre-seed. I looked at my own track record and it was, who knows if we're any good at this job for a long time, but it was fine overall and good overall, but it was actually much stronger at pre-seed and seed than it was at Series A. And I think that part of that is because for me, a lot of what I'm thinking about when I'm backing is founders and markets. And I think once you have some traction, you can actually really understand. It also becomes competitive to a lot of the big players. So if I'm Series A right now, I think it's very hard to be a Series A fund, especially in Europe at the moment. And if you have quick traction, everybody's after you. And if I'm competing against Sequoia and Excel for Series A, it's much harder for me to articulate to a founder why they should go with me as a different fund, other than kind of some of the key brand name platform funds that can continuously fund them into many rounds. And I think that's less true at pre-seed and seed, because pre-seed and seed, before product market fit, it's a very different experience. And so I think if you take money from a huge fund, whether or not they're going to have the time and space to help you is a different question. And probably if you do well anyway, they'll fund you in the next round. And if you don't, then there'll be a signal risk, right? So I think you have to think about what's better for the founders as well.
So as you mentioned there, like you've got the high conviction model at Kindred and you're focusing on Europe. But what else is it about Kindred that, like philosophy-wise, that makes it different, or with your own philosophy, that you kind of sell yourself to like match with different founders with?
The Kindred philosophy resonated extremely deeply with me. I mean, I did a bunch of reference calls before I joined a fund in Europe, like 45 reference calls with founders and LPs and VCs. But at Kindred, we really put founders at the heart of everything that we do. And I wish that that was true across the board, but it's not always the case in the industry. And what that means is a few things. So we share carry with founders. So 20% of the carry pool goes back to founders. So if you're a Kindred founder, you share in the upside of other companies in the same fund as you. But it's much more beyond that. I think it's the fact that we actually do help founders, the fact that when we pass, we try to pass really quickly and be super honest about why. We do NPS scores on every past deal to understand what the experience was like for the founders. We try to help. So we pay for coaching for founders, and we have founder forums, and we have a lot of programs for teams, even including leadership training, like I mentioned, as teams scale. So I think we just think a lot about how to put the founders at the heart of everything you do. And that really resonated with me because I just think should be and is more of a service industry than anything else, even in down markets. But I also think that that's going to win you the best deals, quite frankly. Like, founders increasingly want other founders on their cap table. And we're essentially giving them, 60 to 100 other founders in one line on the cap table with Kindred. And I think that even if you've had founding experience, which everyone at Kindred has been an operator before, which is not that common in Europe, it's about 8% of VCs. It doesn't mean that you actually know how to found a company better. And the tools and tactics are outdated all the time. So if you try to hire a product marketer today versus a year ago, it's already different. And so we just think the best people to learn from each other are founders that are currently building a market.
With the different founder community at Kindred, so you said there's 60 to 100 different people there. Have you experienced where, say, somebody's made a change and like, if there's a particular example you have, and then that's kind of knocked over like dominoes and all of the other founders have found that really useful, and then taken that on board too?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there are shared learnings, right? It depends on in which experience. So there's sometimes at the leadership level, there's sometimes like basically, Facebook or Meta changed the way that they do their ads, and now every consumer company is affected, and can we share the learnings really quickly across that? And so I think it really depends on what the issue is, but there's absolutely shared learnings that can be used across the portfolio. And so we just like to get our founders together in different forums to be able to have those conversations. So we did a founder retreat last year, and also one of the most popular sessions was we had a founder who essentially exited his company, and he felt like he exited it too early. And I think he self-named his talk something like "Why I Failed and like exited too early" or something like that. But like it was about a story of him thinking that he didn't handle it the way he wanted to, and a lot of founders went to that, and we're really excited to kind of hear from that journey and learn from it themselves.
Can you share any of the insights that, did you go to the talk yourself? Could you share?
I did go to the talk myself, but I think we were chatting house rules, so I'll exclude myself for the moment.
I guess we don't know who the founder is, so.
General learnings is also about kind of maintaining a pulse check on your own mental framework as you're a founder, right? So as you know, I have a podcast called Founders Uncut. And part of the reason that I launched that podcast is I think people outside the industry or maybe aspiring founders, it's very in fashion and in vogue right now to be a founder, which has pros and cons. But I don't know if people realize how hard it is to be a founder, right? It's not drinks on Friday with all your buddies in the office. Like it's really challenging, and it really pushes you and challenges you. And a lot of times it's hard to separate your self-worth. Actually, Jason from Ori Biotech, who you're going to be talking to soon, mentioned that. And it's hard to separate your self-worth from the company. And I think sometimes when you're making really long-term decisions, if you're really burnt out and you're not in a good mental state yourself around making the right decisions for you and the company, it's really hard to see through that next obstacle. And so I think it's just also a good reminder to keep a pulse check, not only on how your business is doing, but how you're doing and being able to run that business. And it pushes you to change, right? Running a 10-person organization is completely different than running a 200 person, a 2,000 person. And you have to change your leadership style and how you show up as a founder to do that successfully.
It's one of the things we often deal with, like on the Entrepreneur's Handbook publication, about the number of people who kind of promote this idea about you need to quit your 9 to 5 because then you'll be free. But in reality, like when you're a founder or you're running your own business, you think you're going to go to the 4-hour work week that Tim Ferriss talks about, but usually you actually end up working 24/7, and it's really hard to then take your mind off it. Because like you said, you wrap up what you're doing with your self-worth. And I think that's different with a job. Like when I had a job, I wanted to do my job well. But once I kind of clocked out, that was it. Whereas now, because I'm building something for myself, it kind of reflects on me a lot more. So it's a lot harder to disconnect.
Yeah, and it's your baby. And mostly you have people counting on you, right? You literally have people who you're feeding their families and their salary. And that's a lot of pressure. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I should probably go read the book, because the 4-hour work week to me, I have like no concept of, and it's probably my own fault, but like, I've certainly never had anything close to that. I don't know how one would, but I'm sure somebody can do it somewhere.
Have you ever experienced the burnout phases yourself? And like, what did you do to rebalance after that?
Yes, certainly. I'm probably not good at catching it early enough in myself. So I usually catch it when I'm quite at the end. I think I've employed some rules for myself. So like I had one of those when I was trying to co-found the company in Brazil, when I was still in business school. It was just a lot. It's not the same thing. It's not a real co-founding experience. I wasn't giving up the same thing because I was in school. So I'll caveat it for a second. But I was cross-registered at the undergrad learning Portuguese because one of my co-founders didn't speak English. I was cross-registered at MIT because I thought they had a better startup class that I wanted to do. And I was going down to Brazil every 6 or 8 weeks, and I was on broken Skype calls every day. And I just like took on way too much. And at one point, which is not really my normal personality, I was just like in the middle of like a random class, and I just started like breaking down crying. And I was like, okay, well, and I just felt like I wasn't doing anything really well. But I also just personality wise, I think I have that tendency. I just say yes to a lot of things and then make them happen, and then forget that like, I should probably rest in there somewhere or not work every hour of the day. And so I kind of made a rule for myself after that I was only allowed to commit myself to one thing outside of work, which was the nonprofit stuff for a long time, the stuff I mentioned in Africa. And now I have a son, he's 2, and I have another baby on the way. And I think that's actually been a really healthy thing for me to create some natural boundaries, right? Because like every day, if I can, and 5:30 to 7:30, unless it's like a really important call, I'm not taking it. I'm going to go home and I'm going to see my son and I'm going to put him to bed, and then I go back to work or I'll do something else. But I think that it does create some other additional boundaries for me, which is probably for me really healthy. And just it is hard, to your point, to maintain all the stress of, and I right now I'm not in a startup, right? But it's a very small fund and we feel like we're building it, and there is a lot of pressure you put on yourself sometimes. And you wake up in the middle of the night and you stress out about it, and those things are all real. But also, if I spend 5 minutes with my son, it's like almost impossible not to just like smile and giggle, because he brings a lot of joy. So I think some things have naturally kind of changed as my life stage has changed as well.
Yeah, and before the call started, we kind of mentioned about like the trying to keep perspective on everything as well. And like at all, like before you had your like first son, were you worried about if you were working these long hours beforehand, that would affect you at all? And
for sure. For sure. I think my husband was worried about it. I think we were all worried about it. I still probably work like, I don't know, 70 hours a week or something. So I still work a lot, but I think that it's funny. Somebody once told me this. They're like, they said that our generation really overthinks this like parenting, working thing together. And I think they had a point, because they were like, imagine that I take any of years of your life, right? I take like any 2 years, whether you're going to business school, founding a company, starting a new podcast, whatever you're doing. Like, and I tell you, everything that's going to happen in the next 2 years, it's going to sound daunting, but like, you just figure it out as you go. And kids are kind of like that. Like, I think that, you can really get in your head and be like, how am I going to manage all these things? But the truth is, you make daily decisions every day around where you spend your time and how you do it. And you fuck it up a lot, quite frankly. I fuck it up a lot. Like some days I don't show up the way I wanted to as a mom, and I don't show up the way I wanted to at work, but by and large, I feel like it's pretty doable, and it's pretty, and I get it right a lot, which is great. And so I feel like, at least for me, we'll see how two goes, but the working mom life thing has been good. But there's also different trade-offs. Like, we were thinking about moving outside the city to get a more garden space, and then I kind of realized that most of the reason my life works as a working mom is that I don't have like any commute time. So I can go see my son, put him to bed, and then I can go back out to a work dinner, no problem, be there in 15 minutes. And so we live really, really central, and that's a choice that we're continuing. So I think, you got to figure out what works for you. But for me, it hasn't been as bad as I thought it was going to be going in.
Yeah, I think that's always reassuring, right? Because obviously, some people listening today who are going to be worried about the same thing, about like they want to build something, but then like a lot of people want to have it all, right? You want to have the family, and you want to have the business, and you want to have different things going on. You've made it work, which is obviously something which many people aspire to. And I know you also work with like founders from diverse backgrounds as well. I think through NYC Blend as well. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
I founded this thing with a number of other VCs in New York called NYC Blend. And part of it was to just help underrepresented founders get access to venture. There is really a challenge around that, as we all know the stats. There was a lot of momentum during the Me Too era to do something specifically for women. And I love helping women. I help women on a lot of different fronts. But for some reason, in my view, I felt like if what I did was only specifically for women, it wasn't really diversity inclusion from my perspective, because I am a woman, right? And so for me, the diverse experience is being a Black woman, or being a Latino male, or being LGBTQ, or being disabled, or being an immigrant. And I think for me, it was understanding other people's perspectives, but also trying to get access to a broad range of people to venture. So we partnered up with a number of other VCs, and then we tried a number of things, and we got it wrong a few times, and we got it right a few times. So we started with an event series just to try to get actually more people socially connecting with VCs, which I think was okay, but just didn't really drive outcomes. And then we switched it to sort of a cohort program where you essentially, people apply and they come through affinity groups. So like, we work with people like Lesbians Who Tech and Black Girls Who Code, and they suggest people, and then we go through an application process, and then you get matched up with basically like a VC buddy, right? It's kind of like a big brother, big sister almost in a way. And they help you through your entire raise process, right? So instead of like an office hours, which is quite frankly, a lot of times like a largely check the box exercise that doesn't yield funding. I think there's a lot of conversation about underrepresented founders being over mentored and underfunded. You get somebody who works with you, that helps with your deck, that helps you do intros, and like helps you all the way through to, should I negotiate this in the term sheet or whatnot, until your round is done. And so they're on the second iteration or third iteration of that now. I actually stopped doing that when I moved to Europe, because it's very specific to New York and to the US. But I've gotten involved with a program here called Emerge that SoftBank and Speed Invest and a number of other funds started, which is doing something similar, where we're trying to help more underrepresented founders get access to venture. And we did back something actually out of that program last year. But it's a real problem. I don't have any solutions. And if I pretended to espouse to have solutions, I think something would be wrong. But I think if we all try a little harder in our own versions of the world to do something about it, hopefully you can drive change. And so for me, it's just being way more intentional about what does my natural deal flow look like, and how do I augment that? And I found that you do have to augment it. You do have to spend more time thinking about it, looking in different places, or else you won't get a naturally diverse deal flow pipeline, is the realistic reality today. And so that's just the pragmatic part of me, is like, if that's where we're at today, I'll just keep doing more work to find things in other places. And then hopefully the reality will change in the coming years if we all try and do stuff a little differently.
And so for the diverse founders listening today, what advice would you give them? Would it be to try to find somebody, like, as you mentioned, who can actually take them from like where they are today all the way through, and like look at the different programs for that, or what like practical things can they do?
Yeah, I think there's a few practical things. I think one is we went and interviewed a lot of underrepresented founders before we relaunched NYC Blend with the new program, and to understand what we thought the pain points were. And also we interviewed VCs. And I think one unobvious point is actually the social connection. So a lot of times you're meeting someone for like 30 minutes or an hour, and like that's their first judgment of, are they going to keep the conversation going? That's just how venture works. And if you have a more diverse background, you don't always have the same things to connect on. It's not always like, oh, I know that golf term, or I went to that school, or whatever. And so I think one of the things has been, we need to create more opportunities for people to just socialize, so they start to build a relationship when they're not fundraising. So one thing I would say is find a way to build a relationship when you're not fundraising. That can be sending VCs other deal flow. It can be taking them for a coffee, or talking about the space that you're in, or whatever. And then I also think look at the spaces that get funded as well, because it's really important to map out like the VCs that you want, versus like, and what spaces are getting venture funding, and make sure that you have that overlap and that you know who to go to. Because I've also seen that sometimes, and this is just true for first time founders, it's not even underrepresented founders, but a lot of times they just go to like the 5 brand name firms. It's like, there's like hundreds of VCs out there. So like, get the VC who's actually a good partner for you based on what you're building.
Yeah, and like obviously now that, like you said, there are so many venture capital firms out there, and I think it's only since I really started doing this podcast and looking into more detail, I started realizing how many there are, and also the different focuses they have, right? Because people, like you said, they often think of like Sequoia or like Excel or these kind of different ones, but there's so many which are more specific. Like for example, Kindred has got about like 10 to 15 people, right? So if you're being funded by Kindred, you're going to get much more of the company's attention potentially than if you try to like elbow in with all of the other venture capitalist firms that maybe have hundreds and thousands of investments.
Yeah. I think it really depends on your strategy and what type of support you want, right? Also, like serial founders often are just like, go away, and when I need help, I'll call you. And first time founders actually usually want a lot more help on how they're thinking about building. So I think you just need to educate yourself a bit on the fund landscape and who's the right partner for you.
And like as you mentioned, you've been in like 2 different landscapes, well, more than that, with Brazil and India as well. What do you think like some of the differences between, say, fundraising in Europe versus fundraising in America?
Yeah, so a few differences to the US. I think that service mentality I talked about for founders is actually much more prevalent in the US at large, which I like. I pros and cons to the European market around this. One thing I've seen that I don't like is I see much more predatory, like old school PE behavior in VCs in Europe. Not all of them at all, but like some of them. I just see things that I would have never seen in the US, like, control terms come into a term sheet that are like really aggressive, or people take a predatory amount of a cap table that makes it really hard to finance that company going forward, or university spin out is like untenable cap table. So I see more of that in Europe, and that's actually worse with underrepresented founders in Europe specifically. Like I've seen, a female founder will go through like 3 different accelerators, and now their cap table is like really hard to get funded. So I think there's less education around what is normal, and there's less standardization, especially with local firms versus kind of pan-European VC firms. The second thing is that I feel like founders are not as coached, which I kind of like, to be honest, because it's really coached in the US. So like I was pretty shocked in one of my first few weeks investing in Europe, because I had 2 meetings in a row on a Friday where they put the 5-year projections up, and one of them went to 2 million in 5 years and one of them went to 6 million in 5 years. And like kind of rule of thumb, you should just always show yourself going to 100 million in 5 years, whether or not you believe it. No one's going to hold you to that. And like, they just want to see that you have ambition. But to be fair, I didn't judge it. I just was like, okay, let me understand this more. And in one case, I think it just wasn't really actually a venture business, to be honest. Like, I think it would have been struggled to get anywhere close to a number like that. But the other one, the founder was just like, this is what I'm going to do if I bootstrap. And so like, I didn't put together a plan if I was going to fundraise. I was like, that's totally fair, but you should probably also put together a plan if you're going to fundraise. So I think there's just a little bit less coaching, but I just like that authenticity. I think the hardest part for me to adjust to has been, you also have to understand different cultures, right? So the way that a Dutch founder is going to talk about themselves is very different, or a Danish founder is very different than a US founder. And, they're not going to sell themselves. And so I think you have to understand how to ask questions the right way to have some cultural nuance and understand, what's the best way to ask questions to people. Even reference calls. Like I'm married to an Italian, and that helped me understand that culture. But there was one reference call that I was on that I'll never forget, where the founder gave me the reference. It was like, this is a good reference. And if you would have, like, from an American perspective, the first 15 minutes of that reference call, you wouldn't think the guy even liked him. Like, he was just like, well, he doesn't do this very well, and he doesn't do that very well, and blah, blah, blah. And so I just kind of changed gears, because it was a very scientific company. And so sometimes I was like, I think this guy might be more of a data guy. So like, if you had to put him in like the top percentage of people you've worked with, and he was like, oh, top 0.01%. Would you found a company with them again? Yeah, absolutely. And here's why. Like, I just think it was like a reframing of the questions and how I went about it. But it was there is some cultural nuance sometimes you have to get to.
Yeah, and so obviously with the moving between like New York and Europe, that was just like was that a personal decision, or was it more professional?
Yeah, personal decision.
Yeah. So would you ever say to people who maybe do come across maybe too coached, that they could relax that a bit?
I think it's just whatever's authentic to you, right? Like, I think either way, you do have to think about how you tell the story. It's important to think about that. But I think it should just be whatever's authentic to you. And I think that'll shine through. Like, and every investor has a bias, right? My bias is actually probably more for like scrappy, hustly founders. Some people have a bias towards like really intelligent founders. And I think everyone's got some biases. You do have to be aware of them. But I think that I don't expect it to show up the same way, right? Like I could invest in someone who is extremely coached and extremely great storyteller, and I can invest in someone who's not coached at all and just answers a question very directly. And as I'm saying that, I can think of two people that I found that fit both those profiles. So I think you just probably shouldn't expect it to show up the same way in any given person.
And then, like, for yourself, as you've been investing over the last few years, what lessons have you learned along the way of where your like conceptions of how you thought you'd go about things has changed? That maybe you made mistakes earlier on.
Yeah, I mean, I think plenty of mistakes to make that I've made. I think that I've gotten better at understanding when I truly have gut conviction, right? When it's like my conviction versus FOMO around dynamics or whatnot. Gotten better at that. I think digging in on co-founder dynamics more. I think there are times when you back new co-founding teams and there's always risks to that. And I think understanding how to dig into that more is something that has been really important learning for me. I think in terms of valuation, and it's been interesting to live through the last few years of market and kind of ups and downs, and when I think I've made the right or wrong call by passing on something or going up in valuation on something because I really believed in the team.
And then making the transition from like operating side to VC side. Let's say somebody listening right now is thinking like, okay, I've founded companies in the past and I want to make that shift to investing. How should they start? What are the best things that they could do? Because you went to, was it RRE first? And like, was that the right decision at that time? Do you think that?
So I went to RRE on the operating side. If I thought I had wanted to do investing, I wouldn't suggest going to the operating side of VC first, because a lot of people have a Chinese wall. RRE is a phenomenal fund and they were amazing to me. And so they took a chance on me to do that, but a lot of funds would not have, quite frankly. So I think there is a Chinese wall in the industry still. I think it's breaking down and it's happening more and more, but I think it's still challenging. I think the hard part about investing is there's kind of these two moments. You either go in as like kind of an analyst associate, junior associate, or you go in as like a principal partner level. And it's really hard to get to the senior level unless you've like founded a multi-billion-dollar company if you haven't had any experience at the more junior level. So I think the ways to do it is to basically just get plugged into early stage startups, which you probably already are if you're an operator. You can start angel investing, but I don't really like that one because I feel like not everyone has money to angel invest. I don't really have money to angel invest, so I think it's just like not an accessible one. But I think you can always help founders. So like you can find founders and then you can get into spaces and then you can suggest those companies to VCs. And I think one of the best ways to get on VC's radar is to be a source of deal flow, that they trust your nose. And when you are actually actively interviewing the VCs, the best advice I have, practically speaking, is create a feeling of FOMO, right? Venture capitalists, unfortunately, all day long have FOMO that they're missing out on the best deal or the best thing. And so the more you can give them the sense that they're missing out on you by not hiring you as FOMO, the better off you're going to be. And there's a few practical ways to do that. Like one is you get interest from lots of people. So let's say, I was trying to get hired at a fund and someone connected me. Don't just stop there. Then get like the 3 other people that I know who know someone at that fund to also send a note saying, hey, I heard you're meeting Maria. So glad you're meeting. I love her. Here's why, blah, blah, whatever. Just come from lots of sources. So it feels like it's like bubbling up around them from their network. And then, spaces you're genuinely interested in, send them deals and have interesting insights. And I think it's also good to be additive. So like if you love crypto, but there's a whole crypto fund, you're probably not adding much to that fund. But if you have a generalist fund who's never done any crypto, then maybe you're adding a lot to that fund. So find ways to kind of create that FOMO is part of, I guess, my advice on how to get a job in venture.
So really enjoyed talking to you today, Maria. So let's say somebody listening right now has got an idea or somebody that wants to send you deal flow wise. How can they get in touch with you or how can they get in touch with Kindred? Or let's say they want to start a company and they think they want to work with you.
So definitely don't do LinkedIn. I'm horrible at LinkedIn messages because I get so much spam there. So we have a hello@kindredcapital.vc and we respond to all the emails in there. So I would send it there. And what I would say if you want to start a company is just do it, just try it. And you can try something on the side, you can try something full time, but I would just say whatever you want to do, get into VC, start a company, whatnot. This might be wrong, but I find in life that like if you try hard enough, you can usually find a way to do things. There are some exceptions to that, right? I wanted to make the dance team in college. I wasn't as good of a dancer and I wasn't dancing since I was 7, and there's some things you just can't do in life. But I think the truth is you get a lot of people in life who tell you can't do something. And I find that a lot of times, one thing I've learned for myself is that you kind of box yourself in sometimes and you tell yourself you can't do things, or you tell yourself that you've done career A. And so now you need to do career B because that's what's connected to career A. But if you want to do career X and it has nothing to do with A, just find a way to do it because, you have the permission and you're probably the one holding yourself back. And I'm sure there's a way to do it. So I think whatever it is that you're listening to and you're scratching like I probably should have done it, find a way to do it.